A one-bedroom apartment in New York City can easily cost $3, $4, and even $5,000 a month. That's often the same as, or even more than a mortgage in most parts of the country. So why does rent in New York get this expensive, and why does it stay that way? New York consistently ranks as the most expensive rental market in the United States and one of the most expensive cities in the world. In fact, as of 2026, the median rent across New York City was roughly $3,900 per month. In this video, I'm going to explain why rents in New York are so expensive, and more importantly, why they tend to stay that way. We'll look at the forces behind the market, including the massive demand for housing, why so few apartments are available at any given time, and why it's so expensive to build and operate housing in the city. But before we get into the reasons, just how expensive is New York City? The numbers vary depending on the source and the specific month, but based on recent data, the median rents across the entire city is roughly $3,900 per month. That means that half of apartments rent for less than this, and half rent for more. To put that into context, this means that many renters in New York pay close to $50,000 a year just in rent alone. To break rent prices down even further, a typical one-bedroom across New York City has a median rent of roughly $3,200 to $3,400. For Manhattan, that number jumps to $4,200 for a one-bedroom apartment. For two-bedroom apartments, the median rent across New York City is roughly $4,300 compared to around $6,100 in Manhattan. Now, to be clear, these figures don't include rent-stabilized units or other subsidized housing programs, so they don't represent what every New Yorker is currently paying. However, they are a very good indicator of what someone would expect to pay if they were searching for an apartment on the open market today. So why is housing in New York so expensive in the first place? The first reason is simple, and it's that there's an enormous number of people who want to live here. New York City is home to roughly 8.5 million people, making it the largest city in the United States. However, the demand for housing isn't just coming from people who are already here. It's also coming from all the people who moved to New York from across the country and around the world. For more than a century, New York has been one of the primary gateways for immigration to the United States. Generations of immigrants passed through Ellis Island and established communities throughout the city, which is one of the reasons New York remains such a culturally diverse place today. Those communities often continue to attract new arrivals who already have family, language, and cultural connections here. At the same time, New York is also one of the world's most important economic centers. The city attracts people from nearly every profession, from finance and tech workers to medical professionals working at major hospital systems, to students attending universities, to artists, comedians, and entrepreneurs trying to build careers. All of this means that an enormous number of people are competing for housing in the same relatively small geographic area. And when demand for housing is extremely high, prices tend to rise. But demand is only half of the story. The second major reason rents remain so high in New York is that very few apartments are actually available at any given time. One of the most important numbers that helps explain this is the vacancy rate, which measures the percentage of apartments that are empty and available for rent at a given time. In most cities, a healthy rental market usually has a vacancy rate of around 5 to 7%. That means that there are enough apartments available for renters to have options, and landlords have to compete to attract tenants. In New York, however, that number is dramatically lower. Traditionally, the vacancy rate in New York has often hovered around 1 to 2%, with most recent figures showing a vacancy rate of 1.4%. That means that at any given time, only a tiny fraction of apartments in the entire city are actually available for rent. One interesting thing is that even with reports that people are leaving New York, the vacancy rate shows that the number of available apartments still remains extremely low. And since there are thousands of renters competing for the same limited inventory at any given time, it creates intense competition. And if you've ever tried apartment hunting here, this is exactly why it feels so competitive. It's actually something I see all the time working with renters in New York. So this brings us to the third reason, and one of the biggest questions. Why is the supply of housing in New York so limited in the first place? One of the reasons is that New York simply doesn't have a lot of space to build new housing, especially in Manhattan. Manhattan is an island that's only about 13 miles long and roughly 2 miles wide, and much of it has already been developed for decades. There are relatively few empty lots available for large new housing developments. One exception is Hudson Yards, which is one of the last pieces of land developed at scale in Manhattan. While projects like this do add new housing, much of it tends to be higher-end residential units, which has a limited impact on mid-range or lower-priced housing inventory. Because of this limited space, Manhattan has the highest housing demand and the most limited supply of new housing, which is one of the reasons why rents there are typically much higher than the rest of the city. In contrast, the other boroughs, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island, generally have more space for development and lower housing density in many neighborhoods. That's part of the reason why rents in those boroughs tend to be lower than in Manhattan. However, even in those areas, building new housing is often difficult. Many neighborhoods have strict zoning rules that limit how tall buildings can be or how many apartments can be built on a given piece of land. Construction projects can also take years to approve, and the cost of building in New York is extremely high compared to most other cities. In addition, virtually all new construction tends to be higher-end apartments at a higher price point, which limits accessibility to housing as a whole. In turn, even as new housing becomes available, rents in what were once affordable neighborhoods go up, slowly making these neighborhoods more expensive and less affordable. And when the supply of housing grows slowly while demand continues to rise, the result is exactly what we see in New York today: very limited inventory and very high rents. Now, the fourth reason for high rents in New York is the sheer cost of operating and maintaining rental properties in New York City, which contributes significantly to higher rent prices overall. One of the biggest ongoing costs for landlords is property taxes. New York City has some property taxes in the country, and those taxes can increase over time. When they do, that cost is often passed through to tenants in the form of higher rents. There are also the day-to-day costs of operating a building, which quickly add up. For larger buildings, this includes staff such as superintendents, porters, and property managers, who all need to be paid. For smaller landlords that don't have full-time staff, they still have to pay for maintenance, repairs, and contractors when something breaks. Labor and material costs in New York are also significantly higher than in most other parts of the country. So even with relatively small repairs, they can be very expensive, while larger projects like renovations or major system upgrades can cost tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. Utilities are also another major expense. Depending on the building, landlords are generally responsible for heating, water, and in some cases, electricity, all of which have become more expensive over time. In addition, New York has some of the most tenant-protective housing laws in the country. While these laws are designed to protect renters, they can also increase costs and risks for landlord. For example, if a tenant stops paying rent, the legal process to remove that tenant can take many months, and in some cases, over a year. During that time, the landlord is still responsible for paying the mortgage, taxes, and operating costs for the building. One very important thing to understand is that not all landlords are large corporations. While there are very large institutional owners that operate many buildings and make a lot of money, a significant portion of housing in New York is also owned by small landlords who may only have 1 or 2 properties with mortgages. Many of them operate on very thin margins, and for those smaller landlords, a single non-paying tenant or a major repair can have a significant financial impact, sometimes making it difficult to cover their own expenses. Another cost that has historically played a role in New York's rental markets is a broker's fee. Traditionally, many apartments in New York required the incoming tenant to pay a broker's fee, which could range anywhere from 1 month's rent to 15% of the annual rent. That meant that renters often had to come up with several thousands of dollars up front just to secure an apartment. However, this changed with the passing of the FAIR Act in 2025. Under the new rules, if a landlord hires a broker to rent out an apartment, the landlord is now responsible for paying for that broker's fee. Interestingly enough, this effectively turned what used to be an upfront cost for tenants into an operating cost for landlords. And like many other costs associated with owning and operating a rental property, when expenses increase on the landlord side, that can influence how apartments are priced over time. While the long-term impact of the FAIR Act is still playing out, it's another example of how changes in costs and regulations can ripple through the housing market and affect rent prices more broadly. Now, I made a separate video explaining exactly how broker fees work in New York, so if you're interested in learning more, make sure to check out that video. So all of these factors, property taxes, operating costs, maintenance, labor, fees, and regulatory risks contribute to the overall cost of providing housing in New York. And when these costs for landlords are high, rents tend to reflect that. The fifth reason and factor that pushes rents higher in New York is the type of renters competing for apartments. New York attracts a large number of high-income renters across a wide range of industries, including finance, tech, law, and media, and many of them are able to afford higher rents than the national average. In addition, the city also attracts international renters, corporate relocations, and people moving here for career opportunities, many of whom are entering the market with relatively high budgets. Students also make up a big portion of renters, and a good number of international students come from more affluent backgrounds with the means to afford higher budgets. Because all of these groups are competing for the same limited number of apartments, it tends to push prices up across the board. Even renters who aren't in those higher income brackets often end up competing in the same market, which can make apartments feel expensive relative to what people might expect elsewhere. Now, what about rent-stabilized apartments? Rent-stabilized apartments are actually really interesting because there are actually a lot of them. To put it in perspective, there are roughly 2.2 million rental apartments in New York City, and about 1 million of those are rent-stabilized. Depending on the source, that's about 40 to 40% of all rental apartments. But if you've ever searched for an apartment, you'll notice something immediately. You almost never see them. And that's because how many exist is very different from how many are actually available. One of the biggest reasons is that people who live in rent-stabilized apartments tend to stay in them for a long time, since they're often priced below market and have predictable increases. As a result, turnover is very low compared to market rate apartments. When these units do become available, they also don't always hit the open market in the same way. Sometimes they're filled through existing networks and referrals, building staff, or word of mouth. Another factor is that in some cases, landlords will leave units vacant, especially if the cost of renovating the apartment is high relative to the rent they're allowed to charge under current regulations. Estimates vary, but it's often cited that there are somewhere around 25,000 to 40,000 rent-stabilized units sitting vacant across the city. So even though rent-stabilized apartments make up a huge portion of New York City housing, only a very small percentage are actually available at any given time. As a result, that pushes more people into competing for market rate apartments, which, like everything else, drives prices even higher. So when you break it all down, New York's rental market isn't expensive by accident, it's expensive by design. You have some of the highest demand in the world, paired with some of the lowest availability, layered on top of high costs, strict regulations, and a constant flow of high-income renters. And when all of these forces exist at the same time, prices don't just go up, they stay up. Now, if you're trying to figure out how to actually navigate this market, I've got other videos breaking it down step by step. And if you need help finding a place, you can check out the link below to work with me. Alright, that does it for this video. I'll see you in the next one.